Versatile Podcast. I'm Katie Meyer, VP of Education at APHA, and I'll be your host for this episode. Today, we'll be reviewing a pipeline once weekly insulin efsitora alfa and compare it to once daily insulin degludec in adults with type 2 diabetes. The trial that's being used for submission of efsitora to the FDA for approval was published in June 2025 and then updated in October, and will key in on important details for pharmacists to be aware of. Before we dive in, let me introduce our guests today. We're lucky to have an appy that contributed to this content, so we have three. Levi, Caitlin, and Io, please introduce yourselves.
Hi there, I'm Levi Abels. I'm a student from Pacific University in Oregon, and I'm happy to be here today.
Hi everyone, my name is Caitlin Valentino. I'm the Education Fellow here with APHA. Also happy to be here today.
Hello everyone, my name is Io Adefioye. I am the Advanced Education Fellow, and I am also happy to be here today.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction. So let me start with Levi. Levi, can you give our listeners a little bit of information about the background regarding insulin efsitora and its path and road to FDA approval?
Absolutely. So, insulin efsitora is an investigational once weekly basal insulin injection in development by Eli Lilly as an alternative to the once daily basal insulin injections, such as insulin degludec. Insulin efsitora lends its long acting effect to a conjugation with immunoglobulin G. This binding reduces the insulin's affinity to its receptor while maintaining its full agonism effect. The conjugation also reduces enzymatic activity and allows for hepatic recirculation. So both of these work together to increase the half-life of insulin efsitora, allowing it to provide a glucose-lowering effect for a week before it needs to be redosed. An obvious burden off the shoulders of many diabetic patients. On November 12th of 2025, the maker of insulin efsitora, Eli Lilly, announced that they have submitted a biologics license application to the FDA based on the evidence from their phase 3 trial entitled QWINT, spelled QWINT, which we'll go over the results of here and shortly. If the product gets approved, it will be one of the first weekly insulin injections available in the US and will undoubtedly shape the future of type 2 diabetes treatment.
Thank you so much for that background, Levi, and providing that introduction. All right, let me go to Io next. Could you walk us through the design of the QWINT2 and QWINT5 phase 3 trials, please?
Of course. So let's start with QWINT2, which evaluated insulin efsitora in adults with type 2 diabetes who were insulin naive. The participants had poor glycemic control while on either an oral or non-insulin therapy. Insulin efsitora was compared with once daily insulin degludec as the basal insulin reference. The study followed the participants for 52 weeks, which does help understand how weekly insulin performs over a full year. The primary endpoint was a change in A1C at week 52, with secondary endpoints including fasting plasma glucose, weekly glycemic stability, and hypoglycemia safety. QWINT2 helped determine whether once weekly basal insulin can be an appropriate option for initiating insulin in adults with type 2 diabetes. Alright, now let's transition to QWINT5. This trial provided data that evaluated insulin efsitora in a more intensive insulin using population. This trial enrolled adults with type 1 diabetes who were already using a basal bolus regimen and had a substantial experience with insulin in the past. Again, once weekly insulin efsitora was compared with once daily degludec. Like QWINT2, the study was for 52 weeks, which allowed comparative data versus daily basal insulin. The endpoint again focused on A1C change at week 52. Secondary endpoints included fasting glucose, the time when participants are in range, glycemic variability, and hypoglycemia. QWINT5 determined whether once weekly basal insulin can maintain glycemic control in participants with type 1 diabetes and having past insulin experience.
Great. Thanks so much, Io, for that introduction on the methods. All right, Caitlin. So now can you tell listeners how did insulin efsitora alfa perform compared with insulin degludec?
Sure. In QWINT2, 754 participants with type 2 diabetes completed the trial, and their mean HbA1c differences at the end of the trial were found non-inferior to insulin degludec. The confidence interval here was negative 0.22 to 0.04 and was consistently found non-inferior when accounting for the subgroups of hypoglycemia and GLP-1 use. There were no events of severe hypoglycemia in the efsitora group, and there were 6 in the degludec group. 27.9% of participants in the efsitora group and 21% of participants in the degludec group experienced clinically significant hypoglycemia. In QUINT-5, 692 participants with type 1 diabetes completed the trial, and mean A1C differences at the end of the trial were found non-inferior to insulin degludec. The confidence interval here was negative 0.077 to 0.181, and the p-value was 0.43. No statistical difference between time in range, time above range, or time below range was shown between insulin degludec and insulin efsitora. The event rate of nocturnal hypoglycemia was not statistically significantly different between groups either. The Diabetes Treatment Satisfaction Questionnaire favored insulin efsitora versus insulin degludec at week 26 and remains that way through the end of the study.
Great. Thanks so much for that, Caitlin. All right. Well, with these new long-acting insulins, one thing that certainly come to mind for me was safety. So, Io, what are the key safety findings from the QUINT trials?
Across both of the trials, the safety profile for insulin efsitora was consistent with a long-acting basal insulin. So in QUINT-2, hypoglycemia rates were similar to degludec in insulin-naive participants with type 2 diabetes. But in QUINT-5, however, hypoglycemia occurred more frequently with efsitora compared to degludec. Specifically, non-nocturnal level 2 or 3 hypoglycemia occurred more with insulin efsitora versus insulin degludec, and combined level 2 and 3 hypoglycemia rates were higher with efsitora than with degludec, the highest rates being observed during weeks 1 through 12. Putting that into perspective, QUINT-5 reported 14.3 level 2 or 3 hypoglycemia events per patient year with efsitora. When we compare that to once weekly icodec in episode 2 with Onward 6, that study reported 17 level 2 or 3 events per patient year. So weekly basal insulin as a class may show higher early hypoglycemia rates in more intensive insulin using populations. Injection site reactions were also a common adverse effect, but it was generally mild. No new or unexpected safety concerns were identified, but clinicians should exercise caution during titration. When monitoring, patients should continue their regular glucose monitoring, especially during initiation or dose adjustments. Overall, the safety profile across both type 1 and type 2 diabetes populations support the clinical viability of once-weekly efsitora.
Thanks so much, Io, Levi, and Caitlin for such an insightful review of this pipeline agent, insulin efsitora alpha. Let me summarize key takeaways for our listeners. 2 of the studies that were conducted to evaluate the safety and efficacy of efsitora were called QUINT-2 and QUINT-5. QUINT-2 evaluated the drug in adults with type 2 diabetes who were insulin naive compared to insulin degludec over 52 weeks, and QUINT-5 evaluated patients with type 1 diabetes who were already using basal bolus regimens and had substantial experience with insulin in the past. Both studies found insulin efsitora alpha to be non-inferior to insulin degludec. In QUINT-2, hypoglycemia rates were similar to degludec in insulin-naive participants with type 2 diabetes, but in QUINT-5, however, hypoglycemia occurred more frequently with efsitora compared to degludec. It'll be interesting to see what the FDA decides on this pipeline agent, and I appreciate the 3 of you, Levi, Caitlin, and Io, reviewing the evidence. All right, folks, that's all the time we have for today. In our next episode, we'll cover the other long-acting pipeline agent, insulin icodec. Don't forget to visit the Learning Library at learn.pharmacist.com to earn your CE for this month's podcast. Take care, and thanks for listening.